I'm Lori Cardoza-Moore, and welcome to Focus on Israel. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Focus on Israel. I'm Lori Cardoza-Moore, president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating Christians about their biblical responsibility to the Jewish people. Many Christians do not realize that the Word explicitly tells us to stand with our Jewish brethren and defend the land God calls His. Last week, we continued our teachings on the evidence for the Jewish state. We started with the biblical evidence, as I had a chance to travel to Israel and meet with and interview two leading rabbis from Jerusalem. Over the last 2 weeks, we focused on the archaeological and historical evidence for the state of Israel, and I spoke with prominent archaeologists and historians in Israel. So please go to the PJTN website to review these important lessons, as well as our first 4 lessons on anti-Semitism. Today we look at the political basis and evidence to support the State of Israel. We'll see that there is a political basis for the birth of Israel and that international law gives Israel the right to the land it won during its wars of survival. The fact that Israel has fought several times against overwhelming odds to stay alive is probably one of the greatest testaments to the Jewish people inhabiting the land God calls His. It has only been through God's hand and His miracles that Israel has beaten back its enemies. Modern Jewish history begins with the establishment of the Jewish homeland in 1948. This was foretold in the scriptures in Isaiah 66, verse 8. Years before the birth of the modern Zionist movement, more than 10,000 Jews lived throughout what is today Israel, and that number grew exponentially as extreme anti-Semitism rose in Europe and Russia. In 1917, Britain was issued the mandate for Palestine, which included the Balfour Declaration. It specifically referred to the historical connections of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the moral validity of reconstituting their national home in that country. The term reconstituting shows recognition of the fact that Palestine had been the Jewish homeland. Furthermore, the British were instructed to use their best endeavors to facilitate Jewish immigration, to encourage settlement on the land, and to secure the Jewish national home. The word Arab does not appear in the mandatory award. The mandate was formalized by the 52 governments at the League of Nations on July 24, 1922. On my last trip to Israel, I had the good fortune to speak with and learn from several experts in the area of modern Jewish history. Next, you'll be hearing from 3 of them. The first is Chris Mitchell, who serves as the Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. Next will be Lenny Ben-David, a former Deputy Ambassador for Israel to Washington, D.C. And finally, you'll hear from Dr. Arieh Eldad, a member of the Knesset, which is the legislative body for Israel. All 3 gave me great insight into the birth of the modern state of Israel.
One of the forgotten things in history is something called the San Remo Resolution. It was passed in 1920. After World War I, the great powers of the world at that time, the conquering powers, got together in San Remo, Italy, and decided what to do with the Middle East. And they divided up the land. And they gave a mandate to the nation of Britain at the time, called the British Mandate, where they promised a Jewish homeland. Now that was ratified by international law, by the San Remo Resolution, also by the League of Nations in 1922. Several weeks later, by the U.S. Congress itself, ratified the San Remo Resolution, giving this land to the Jewish people. That's something that's been forgotten for many, many years, but some people now are reviving this. And many people, and it's a compelling argument, that many people believe that the future UN resolutions that were passed in decades after that really don't hold water. And the mandate actually charged the British government with establishing this as a Jewish homeland. The rest of the Middle East was carved up for the Arabs. And so this land was given exclusive political rights to the Jewish people. The other peoples in the lands, the Arabs, were given civil rights and religious rights, and then they were given political rights in the land surrounding Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. So if you go back to international law, you can go back to the 1920 San Remo Resolution and see that it ratified the right of the Jewish people to establish their homeland in Israel.
There's an interesting phenomenon for those who like American history, and I'm one who does, and that is you have virtually every president, going back to John Adams, talking about the need for a Jewish homeland and a desire for Jews to go to Palestine. And part of this was seen in various congressional statements in the 19th century, and there was a similar buildup of sentiment in Britain as well. And a politician named Arthur Balfour, already I believe in 1914 or so, started raising the possibility of a homeland for the Jewish people. When he became Lord Balfour, when he became a politician in 1917, appointed a politician, he actually worked with the Zionist leadership and Arab leadership to work on a Zionist homeland, a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And this was part of the British effort, even the war effort against the Ottoman Empire, to say we want to set up, once the Ottomans are gone, such a Jewish homeland. It was to be located on both sides of the Jordan River. It was to go from the Mediterranean almost to Iraq. And later, subsequently, the whole side, the Transjordan, the side east of the Jordan River, was peeled off and given to the Hashemite Emir Abdullah, and that became Transjordan and then the Kingdom of Jordan. So the Palestine homeland for the Jews was already lopped off. 20% was left for the Jewish people after Balfour and the British got through with this. Even then, there was subsequently an attempt to partition that land into an Arab state and a Jewish state, but it was never to be considered a Palestinian Arab state. The term Palestinian Arab didn't come into being until many years later. Indeed, the Jews who lived in the British Mandate were called Palestinian Jews, and you had Palestinian Arabs. The term Palestinian, to represent Arabs of the location, came up years later.
The war is a religious war. For them, Christians and Jews are forever infidels, and they will never, by the Islam, will never be able to recognize the right of any infidel to rule over such a Muslim land. The declaration of Abu Mazen about Temple Mount is just a symptom of his religious war, because if we, the Jews, had the first temple here, the second temple here, 1700 years before Muhammad was born, then he will lose the religious ground of his demands, because his demands will be false. So what the Muslims are saying, there never was a temple here. It was always a mosque. The temple was a mosque according to their definition. They don't say nothing was built there. They said a mosque was built there. I said, a mosque before Muhammad? Yes, everything is a mosque, everything. The Arabs were here many years before they invaded Israel. History was different. When you fight a clash of civilization, when you fight a religious war, the effort to distort the past, to distort history, to distort the truth, to distort religion are as important as long-range missiles in the current war, because this is not a territorial clash. This is not a conflict that can be solved by giving up another mile or 2 miles somewhere in the Mediterranean. It's a principle war. And when your basic beliefs, your religion, your ideology is fighting another one, you have to annihilate the other ideology, to make it non-existent. And therefore, the temple, according to the Palestinian, never stood on Temple Mount. The Israel kingdom never was here. King David wasn't here. Everything started with the Muslim and will end with the Muslim. All the rest is not history, not existent.
As we can see, several lawful mandates and declarations made by the powers of the world established the State of Israel. Thus, 78 years of nation building beginning in 1870 culminated in the reestablishment of the Jewish state. So Israel's international birth certificate was validated in many ways by the promise of the Bible, uninterrupted Jewish presence from the time of Joshua onward, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the San Remo Resolution of 1920, the League of Nations Mandate, which incorporated the Balfour Declaration, the United Nations Partition Resolution of 1947, Israel's admission to the UN in 1949, the recognition of Israel by most other states, and most of all, the society created by Israel's people in decades of thriving, dynamic national existence. Several years back, I had the chance to visit Independence Hall, the very room where Israel signed its declaration of statehood. I must admit to having such an overwhelming feeling of awe that biblical prophecy became reality there. If you make a trip to Israel, you must be sure to visit. Unfortunately, the Arab nations surrounding Israel did not agree to any Jewish state and proceeded to attack the new country as the Jewish people danced in the streets. Multiple wars of defense against these aggressors has meant the loss of many lives and territorial gain for Israel. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel won control over a large part of its ancient homeland, much of which was ancient Judea. This part of the Middle East is now referred to as the disputed territory of the West Bank. To help you better understand the politics of the West Bank, I'd like to play for you a video piece produced by my friends at Stand With Us, a highly respected pro-Israel organization. Danny Ayalon, former Israel ambassador to the U.S., hosts this fast-paced teaching.
Often on the news, we hear the terms occupied territories, 67 borders, and illegal settlements. And the story we usually hear sounds very simple. During the Six-Day War, Israel captured the West Bank from the Palestinians, refused the United Nations' demand to retreat, and illegally built settlements. But is that really the case? Let's try to understand the situation a little bit better. We'll start with a simple but extremely important question. From whom did Israel capture the West Bank? From the Palestinians? No. In 1967, there was no Arab nation or state by the name of Palestine. Actually, was there ever? Israel took over the West Bank from Jordan in an act of self-defense, after Jordan joined a war launched by Egypt and Syria to destroy Israel. Oh, by the way, destroying countries is rather illegal. The United Nations back in 1967 rejected repeated Arab and Soviet attempts to declare Israel as the aggressor. Security Council Resolution 242 did not demand a unilateral Israeli withdrawal. Rather, the United Nations called for negotiating a solution which would leave Israel with secure and recognized boundaries. In effect, defensible borders. But wait a second. What was Jordan doing in the West Bank in the first place? What was its legal justification? Well, Jordan had it had no legal justification. Jordan simply occupied it during its previous attempt to destroy the newly established State of Israel in 1948, changing the commonly accepted name Judea and Samaria to the West Bank. But that did not really convince anybody. And almost no one recognized the legality of Jordan's occupation, not even any of the other Arab states. So, if Jordan had no legal claim to the land, and a Palestine did not exist, whose territory is it? Let's go a little further back in time. Don't worry, not to the days of the Bible, only about 100 years. Until 1917, the Ottoman Empire occupied the whole region. After losing in World War I, the Ottomans relinquished their 500-year control to the Allied forces, which decided to divide the old empire into countries. Britain's foreign minister, Lord Balfour, recognized the Jewish people's historical right to their homeland. A small area, equivalent to about 0.5% of the Middle East, was designated for this purpose. Britain received a mandate from the League of Nations to promote the establishment of a Jewish homeland. But wait a second, do you realize what happened? The Jewish homeland originally included not only the West Bank, but also the East Bank of the Jordan River. I guess you cannot say the Jewish people have not accepted some painful compromises already. Anyway, the League of Nations recognition of a Jewish homeland, which includes the West Bank, was reaffirmed by the United Nations after the Second World War. With the British mandate ending, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181 recommended the establishment of two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jews accepted it and went on to create the State of Israel, while the Arabs refused the compromise and launched a war to destroy the newly established Jewish state. Resolution 181, a non-binding recommendation in the first place, remained with no legal standing. At the end of the war, a ceasefire line was formed, where the Israeli and Arab forces stopped fighting. At the insistence of the Arab leaders, this line was defined as having no political significance. So, although this line is commonly referred to as the 1967 border, it is not from 1967, and it was never an international border. This is why a more exact legal definition for the West Bank, according to international law, is really the same as in so many other areas where there are or were territorial disputes, but which are not defined as occupied. For example, Zubarah, the Tams Islands, the Western Sahara, amongst many others. They're not considered occupied territories, but rather disputed territories. So, let's return for a moment to our illustration and examine the complete chain of events. Israel's presence in the West Bank is the result of a war of self-defense. The West Bank should not be considered occupied because there was no previous legal sovereign in the area, and therefore the real definition should be disputed territory. The 1947 partition plan has no current legal standing, while Israel's claim to the land was clearly recognized by the international community during the 20th century. That is why the presence and construction of Israeli settlements in the West Bank should not be considered illegal. These are not just my own opinions. They are based on conclusions made by world-renowned jurists like Professor Eugene Rastow, Justice Arthur Goldberg, and Stephen Schwebel, who headed the International Court of Justice. So what's the solution for the dispute over the West Bank? Unfortunately, there is no magic solution. But the only way a solution will ever be reached is if we base our negotiations on legal and historical facts. So please, let's stop using the terms occupied territories and 67 borders. They're simply not politically correct.
I pray you were enlightened and hopefully a bit entertained by that well-made cartoon. Finding peace in Israel is truly a very serious matter, but if you look at some of the ridiculous claims by Arabs, you almost can't help but laugh. A large issue that Israel deals with in the world's political realm and with its neighbors can be summed up in one word: borders. What and who actually dictates where the border lines are drawn? I spoke with Knesset member Dr. Arieh Eldad about this issue while in Israel. I believe you'll find his point of view based solidly in international law and past world history.
Borders all over the world are usually the result of the condition of the end of a war and the peace agreement that followed. All the borders in Europe were created like that. They were changed. They were changed after the war in 1870. They were changed after First World War, and changed again after Second World War, and now they changed again after the war in the Balkan. And after the nations look at the end result of the war, they may reach an agreement about the border. The borders in Israel only partially agreed upon by the sides as a result of a previous wars. We have an internationally recognized border with Egypt. These were the ceasefire lines and the international borders of 1903 and the ceasefire lines of 1949 that later were adopted by both sides, and we have peace agreement. This is an international border. We have an international border with Jordan. That's the Jordan River. We agreed upon in the peace agreement. We have an international border with Lebanon, even though we don't have peace agreement, because this is an older border that was drawn by the Sykes-Picot document toward the end of First World War between Britain and France. But we do not have any recognized border between us and the Palestinians, because they were never a side to any of these wars or any of these agreements. What we call the 67 borders were only the ceasefire lines between Israel and Jordan at the end of the War of Independence. And the ceasefire agreement that was signed in Rhodes specified that these are not the final borders, and these final borders should be agreed upon in any peace agreement. We do not have peace agreement. That's for the 67 lines have no international meaning by the international law. They are not borders.
Over the last few weeks, we've looked at the overwhelming evidence that supports the State of Israel. From the early inscription of the name of Israel in Egypt over 3,000 years ago to the UN resolution establishing the modern Jewish homeland. We see strong evidence of support at the levels of archaeological science, historical records, biblical texts, and political resolutions and laws. So much so that who can deny Israel's right to exist and her rights to the land won in wars of defense? Abba Eban, one of Israel's greatest statesmen, had a powerful statement to those who denied Israel's right to existence. He said, "Nobody does Israel any service by proclaiming its right to exist. Israel's right to exist, like that of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and 152 other states, is axiomatic and unreserved. Israel's legitimacy is not suspended in midair awaiting acknowledgement. There is certainly no other state, big or small, young or old, that would consider mere recognition of its right to exist a favor or a negotiable concession." So, ladies and gentlemen, God's word is true, and He is true yesterday, today, and forevermore. You know, it's interesting because we look at what's happening in the Middle East today and we see the same struggle that Israel was facing in years before with the Arabs. And I want to encourage you, if you have your Bible with you, turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. And I want to read from these scriptures because it's very interesting and quite timely to read these verses and see what was happening during the time of Nehemiah. And we're going to start reading at verse 17 of Nehemiah 2. But to put it in context, if you remember, Nehemiah was given leave by the king to go back to Jerusalem to assess the damage in order to rebuild the city. So we start at verse 17 where he says, "Then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, Let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to do this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king?" So I answered them and said to them, "The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem." Just like back in Nehemiah's day, the Arabs all said that they had rights to Jerusalem. And here Nehemiah is confirming that this city belongs to the Jewish people. And God would prosper them. And just like today, God will prosper the Jewish people. He will defend Israel. He will establish them in that land. I want to just thank you, and I hope that we've helped to increase your knowledge and love for the Jewish people today and for the state of Israel. As always, we so appreciate hearing from you. Please send your comments and questions to comments@pjtn.org. When time allows, I'll answer them on our program. The time to stand up is now. Be a leader in your community and in your church. One person can make a difference. Get involved with and support pro-Israel organizations such as PJTN. Call your senators, congressmen, the White House. Let your elected leaders hear from you. Visit our website to learn more. Sign up to receive action alerts and order our films to share with family and friends. I want to thank you for watching our program today. Be sure to join us next week as we'll be focusing on the relationship between the nations of the world and the state of Israel. God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren and all Israel. We'll see you next time on Focus on Israel.
You've been watching Focus on Israel. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, P.O. Box 682711, Franklin, Tennessee 37068. You can also support PJTN online. Visit pjtn.org or call 1-877-873-9020.
Anti-Semitism has reached epic proportions, and Israel is now surrounded by nations who seek its destruction. For Israel to lose just one battle would mean losing everything. As Christians, it is our biblical responsibility to stand with our Jewish brethren and Israel. PJTN needs your help to reach more Christians with this urgent message. Please visit our website to become a member today and order our award-winning documentaries. You must decide that you won't be silent. Sign up now at pjtn.org. God bless you, and thank you for your support and prayers.
I will not keep silent, for Zion.